Guyana is hiding something. Most people can't even find it on a map. Half the world confuses it with Ghana, and the other half confuses it with a French territory 2 countries away. But look closer and you'll find a nation sitting below sea level, protected from the ocean by Dutch engineering. A waterfall 5 times the height of Niagara that almost nobody visits. A jungle commune where over 900 people died in a single night in 1978. A tabletop mountain that inspired a novel about dinosaurs. And right now, in 2026, a territorial dispute over land the size of Georgia that could decide who controls one of the largest oil discoveries of the century. This isn't the forgotten corner of South America people assume it is. It's a place history keeps circling back to. These are 25 facts about Guyana that even people who think they know this country have probably never heard. Everything here is real. Let's start with number 25. Fact 25. The country everyone mixes up with somewhere else. Say Guyana out loud to most people and watch what happens. Some hear Ghana and picture West Africa. Others assume you mean French Guiana, the French territory next door that actually houses Europe's rocket launch site and the old Devil's Island penal colony. None of that is Guyana. Guyana is its own independent country, a former British colony sandwiched between Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname, with its own language, currency, and government. The mix-up isn't entirely unreasonable. The 3 countries along this stretch of coast, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, are collectively still nicknamed the Guianas because they were carved up by rival European colonizers who never bothered to give them distinct-sounding names. But Guyana has spent decades being the one nobody can quite place, even while it sits at the center of some of the hemisphere's biggest stories. Fact 24. The only English-speaking country in South America. Every other country on the South American continent speaks Spanish or Portuguese. Guyana speaks English. It's the direct legacy of nearly 200 years of British colonial rule as British Guiana, and it means Guyana has almost nothing culturally in common with its Spanish and Portuguese-speaking neighbors. Instead, it identifies as Caribbean. It's a full member of the Caribbean community, CARICOM. Its cricketers play for the West Indies instead of any South American team, and its old colonial capital still runs on a British-style layout of avenues and squares. Geographically, Guyana is South American. Culturally, it belongs to a different region entirely, an island nation in spirit that just happens to be attached to a continent. Fact 23. A capital city built below sea level. Georgetown, Guyana's capital, sits roughly 3 to 6 feet below high tide level. The only reason the Atlantic Ocean hasn't reclaimed it is a 280-mile seawall and a network of Dutch-built drainage canals, dikes, and sluice gates called cokers, engineering brought over by Dutch colonists who settled this coast starting in the early 1600s. The Dutch had already spent centuries fighting the sea back home, and they used the same tricks here. Enclose the swampy coastline behind earthen walls, then drain it plot by plot into productive land. It worked well enough to turn the coast into some of the richest sugar country in the Caribbean. It also means Georgetown today faces almost the exact same existential problem as Amsterdam. Stay ahead of the water forever or lose the city back to the sea. Fact 22. The tallest wooden building on Earth. Rising above Georgetown's low skyline is St. George's Cathedral, a gleaming white Gothic-style structure that looks like it should be made of stone. It isn't. It's built almost entirely out of wood, and it's widely cited as the tallest wooden building in the world. Constructed in the 1890s, the cathedral used greenheart, a dense local hardwood so tough it resists rot, termites, and even shipworm, which is exactly why colonial Georgetown was built almost entirely out of timber in the first place. Most cities that build this tall reach for stone or steel. Guyana reached for its own rainforest instead, and the result has survived well over a century of tropical heat, humidity, and hurricanes it was never supposed to withstand. Fact 21. A market shipped across the Atlantic in pieces. Georgetown's most recognizable landmark isn't a government building or a monument, it's a food market. Stabroek Market, with its bright red clock tower, has anchored the city's waterfront since 1880. What makes it strange is how it was built. The entire cast iron structure was manufactured on the other side of the Atlantic by an American ironworks company in Delaware, then disassembled, shipped across the ocean in crates, and bolted back together in Georgetown. It was a genuinely advanced piece of Victorian engineering for its time. designed with airy, open ironwork suited to the tropical heat. More than 140 years later, it's still the beating commercial heart of the capital. Thousands of vendors and shoppers moving through it every single day. Fact 20. A name that means land of many waters. Guyana's name comes from an indigenous word roughly translating to land of many waters, and the country does everything it can to earn it. Three major rivers, the Essequibo, the Demerara, and the Berbice, cut through the country and give it its old colonial regional names. By some counts, there are several hundred waterfalls scattered across the interior, most of which have never been formally surveyed, let alone visited. Guyana is a country that is, quite literally, defined by water, from the tidal rivers that shaped its economy to the seawall that keeps its capital dry. Fact 19. A waterfall 5 times the height of Niagara that almost nobody sees. Deep in the rainforest sits Kaieteur Falls, where the Potaro River plunges 741 feet in a single uninterrupted drop, nearly 5 times the height of Niagara Falls and about twice the height of Victoria Falls. It's one of the most powerful waterfalls on Earth by the combined measure of height and water volume. And yet fewer than 10,000 people see it in an average year. There are no roads to Kaieteur. The only way in is a small charter plane to a grass airstrip or a multi-day trek through the jungle with a guide. A waterfall that would be a national obsession anywhere else in the world sits almost entirely alone, roaring into an empty gorge that most Guyanese themselves will never visit. Fact 18. 2/3 of the country is actively disputed by another nation. Look at a map of Guyana and you'll notice the western half is often shaded differently or marked with a border that isn't quite settled. That's the Essequibo region, an area larger than the state of Georgia that makes up close to 2/3 of Guyana's total land. Venezuela has claimed it for over a century, even though Guyana has administered it continuously since an international arbitration award in 1899. The dispute isn't ancient history. In December 2023, Venezuela held a referendum asking its citizens whether the country should annex Essequibo outright, and tensions have stayed high since, especially after major offshore oil reserves were discovered in the disputed waters. The case is currently in front of the International Court of Justice. Most people have never heard of the Essequibo. It's one of the more serious territorial standoffs happening anywhere on the planet right now. Fact 17. The country that's named in spirit after a myth about gold. For centuries, European explorers chased a legend of a hidden city of gold somewhere in the South American interior, a legend that became known as El Dorado. Guyana was one of the places that obsession pointed toward, and it turned out there really was gold here, just not a golden city. Small-scale mining became such a defining part of interior life that Guyana has its own word for the miners who work it: pork knockers. Prospectors who head into the bush for weeks at a time searching riverbeds for gold and diamonds. Gold remains one of the country's major exports today. The myth was wrong about a city. It wasn't wrong about the gold. Fact 16. Standing on some of the oldest rock on the planet, beneath Guyana's rainforest lies the Guyana Shield, a slab of the Earth's crust so old that parts of it are estimated at close to 2 billion years in age, among the oldest exposed rock anywhere on the surface of the planet. That ancient geology is exactly why the region is so mineral rich. Billions of years of slow geological processes concentrated gold, diamonds, and bauxite into the rock beneath the jungle floor. When a pork knocker pans a riverbed in the Guyanese interior, they're sifting through material that's been sitting there since before complex life existed on Earth. Before we keep going, if there's a Guyana story your family knows that isn't on this list, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Back to it. Fact 15. The slave rebellion that came 28 years before Hades. In February 1763, an enslaved Akan man known as Cuffy led one of the largest and most organized slave uprisings in the history of the Americas, in the Dutch colony of Berbice in what is now Guyana. At its peak, Cuffy's forces controlled most of the colony. He declared himself governor and proposed splitting Berbice in half between the formerly enslaved population and the Dutch as equals. The rebellion was eventually crushed after Dutch reinforcements arrived from Europe, and Cuffy is believed to have taken his own life rather than be recaptured. It happened 28 years before the Haitian Revolution, and today Cuffy is Guyana's national hero. The anniversary of the uprising, February 23rd, is celebrated as Republic Day, and a 15-foot bronze monument to Cuffy stands in the middle of Georgetown. Fact 14. the workers who reshaped Guyana after slavery ended. When slavery was abolished across the British Empire in 1838, plantation owners in British Guyana needed a new labor force, and they found it in India. That same year, two ships, the Whitby and the Hesperus, arrived carrying the first indentured Indian laborers, brought to work the same sugar fields under grueling multi-year contracts. Over the next 80 years, roughly 240,000 more followed. Most stayed permanently after their contracts ended. Their descendants today make up close to 40% of Guyana's population, the single largest ethnic group in the country, and Indian Arrival Day is now a national holiday. A labor system built to replace slavery ended up permanently reshaping who Guyana is. Fact 13. 6 peoples, 1 nation. Modern Guyana isn't built around one dominant culture. It's a genuine blend. Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese populations make up the majority, alongside indigenous Amerindian communities who were there long before any European arrived, plus smaller Chinese and Portuguese communities who came as indentured laborers of their own, and a large mixed race population on top of all of it. The country's own motto sums it up: one people, one nation, one destiny. Walk through a Georgetown market on a weekend and you'll hear Hindi film music, reggae, and Amerindian craftwork all competing for the same street corner. Few countries this small pack in this much cultural range. Fact 12. The jungle commune that ended in one of the deadliest mass deaths in American history. In the 1970s, an American religious leader named Jim Jones moved roughly 1,000 followers of his group, the People's Temple, deep into the Guyanese jungle to build what he called a socialist utopia. On November 18, 1978, after a visiting U.S. congressman and members of his delegation were murdered at a nearby airstrip, Jones ordered his followers to drink a cyanide-laced drink. More than 900 people died that day, roughly a third of them children. It remains one of the largest single losses of American civilian life outside of a natural disaster in the country's history. The compound, known as Jonestown, no longer exists in any visible form. The jungle has almost entirely reclaimed the site, but the name is still, for many people outside Guyana, the only thing they've ever heard about this country. Fact 11. The real-life Lost World. On Guyana's western border, where it meets Venezuela and Brazil, a flat-topped mountain called Mount Roraima rises almost 9,000 feet straight out of the savanna, its summit wrapped in clouds so often it looks like an island floating above the jungle. The rock is nearly 2 billion years old, and its isolation over millions of years produced plants and animals found nowhere else on the planet, including carnivorous pitcher plants and a jet-black toad that can't even hop, only crawl. Author Arthur Conan Doyle based his 1912 novel The Lost World, the story that imagined dinosaurs surviving on an isolated plateau, directly on this mountain. Guyana holds a slice of its base, right at the point where 3 countries meet on its summit. Fact 10. A savanna nicknamed the Land of Giants. In Guyana's southern interior, the Rupununi Savanna is home to some of the largest versions of nearly every animal that lives there. Giant river otters that grow over 6 feet long, giant anteaters with 6.5-foot bodies, an estimated 400 to 500 jaguars, one of the healthiest jaguar populations left anywhere in the Americas, harpy eagles with 7-foot wingspans nesting in the rainforest canopy, and in the rivers, arapaima, a fish that can grow past 10 feet and 400 pounds, one of the largest freshwater fish on Earth. That hasn't changed much in over 100 million years. This is wildlife density that rivals East Africa's plains, and most people outside South America have never heard the word Rupununi in their lives. Fact 9. One of the last truly untouched rainforests left on the planet. Roughly 90% of Guyana is still covered in rainforest, and a large share of it has barely been touched by logging or agriculture. Guyana is regularly cited as one of the handful of countries left on Earth with both very high forest cover and very low deforestation rates, which has made it a case study for international climate and conservation programs. Large stretches of the Iwakrama forest and the interior beyond it remain effectively unmapped at ground level. In a world where tropical forest is disappearing at a documented measurable pace almost everywhere else, a country roughly the size of the United Kingdom has managed to keep most of its jungle intact, largely because almost nobody lives out there. From one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere to the fastest growing economy on Earth, In May 2015, ExxonMobil announced a massive oil discovery off Guyana's coast in the same waters now at the center of the Essequibo dispute. The transformation since has been staggering. Guyana's economy has grown by 30, 40, even over 60% in a single year at points since production began, repeatedly making it the fastest growing economy anywhere in the world. A country whose GDP was around $4 billion in 2015 is now approaching $30 billion. The government set up a natural resource fund to try to avoid the resource curse that has wrecked other oil-rich nations, investing revenue rather than spending it all at once. Whether that plan holds is still an open question, but the raw numbers alone have turned one of South America's least talked about countries into one of the most closely watched economies on the planet. Fact 7. A spirit assassin still spoken of in the interior. Long before oil or gold, Amerindian communities across Guyana's interior developed their own explanation for sudden, unexplained deaths. Kanaima, a shape-shifting spirit or cursed individual believed to carry out ritual vengeance on behalf of someone who has been wronged. It isn't ancient trivia confined to old books. Kanaima is still referenced by some interior communities today as a real, if greatly feared, explanation for deaths that don't have an obvious cause. It's one of the clearest threads connecting modern Guyana back to belief systems that predate European contact by centuries, still alive in the same forests the jaguars and giant otters call home. Fact 6. A country split in two by its own geography. Roughly 90% of Guyanese people live squeezed onto a narrow strip of coastal land, much of it below sea level, protected by that Dutch-built seawall. Meanwhile, roughly 90% of the country's actual land area is rainforest interior that the overwhelming majority of Guyanese citizens will never set foot in during their entire lives. It's an almost perfect inversion. Nearly everyone lives on a sliver of reclaimed swamp, while nearly all the land and nearly all the gold, jaguars, and uncontacted forests sit somewhere most of the population has only ever seen in photographs. Fact 5. A flag designed by a 20-year-old American student. Guyana's national flag, nicknamed the Golden Arrowhead, is one of the most distinctive designs in the world. A green field, a red triangle bordered in black, and a gold arrowhead bordered in white, stretching almost the full length of the flag. It was designed years before independence by an American student named Whitney Smith, who would go on to become one of the world's leading flag historians as part of an international design competition. The Guyanese government kept his core concept and added the black and white borders for definition. The colors themselves spell out the country in miniature: green for the forest, gold for mineral wealth, white for the rivers, red for the energy of nation building, black for endurance. A flag written by an outsider ended up becoming one of the most recognizably Guyanese things in the country. Fact 4. The lily that accidentally designed one of the most famous buildings in the world. In 1837, a specimen of an enormous water lily was collected from Guyana's rivers and sent back to England, where it caused a sensation, eventually named Victoria in honor of the Queen. Its leaves can grow past 6 feet across and support the weight of a small child without sinking, held up by a ribbed structure of radiating veins underneath. When the gardener and architect Joseph Paxton got a specimen to study, he became fascinated by exactly that structure and used the same ribbon brace pattern as the engineering basis for London's Crystal Palace, the enormous glass and iron exhibition hall built in 1851, one of the most influential buildings of the Victorian era. A plant pulled out of a Guyanese river ended up shaping the skeleton of a landmark that changed architecture. It's now Guyana's national flower. Fact 3. The national bird that smells like manure. Guyana's national bird is the hoatzin, and it looks like it wandered out of a different geological era entirely. A spiky blue-faced crest, red eyes, and a body built more like a pheasant crossed with a turkey. Its chicks are born with tiny claws on their wings that let them climb back into trees if they fall out of the nest, a trait almost no other living bird has, and one that closely echoes what paleontologists believe early bird ancestors looked like. And because the hoatzin digests leaves through a slow fermentation process similar to a cow's, it's earned a much less flattering nickname across the region: the stink bird. Guyana picked a national bird that looks prehistoric, acts like nothing else alive, and doesn't exactly smell like a national symbol should. Fact 2. A country connected to its own continent by exactly one bridge. Despite sitting on the South American mainland, Guyana has no paved highway connecting it to Venezuela or Suriname. The only land route out to a neighboring country runs south through the interior to a single bridge over the Kaieteur River at the town of Lethem, connecting to Brazil. Beyond that, most of the interior is reachable only by small aircraft, riverboat, or dirt trail. For a country attached to an entire continent, Guyana behaves in practice far more like an island, cut off by its own unbroken jungle, more easily reached by plane from Miami than by road from most of its own neighbors. A country the world keeps forgetting it needs to pay attention to. Every thread in this list keeps circling back to the same idea. Guyana is a place people mislabel, a capital city that shouldn't exist below sea level, but does. A waterfall taller than almost anything on the continent that almost nobody sees. A mountain that inspired a story about a lost prehistoric world, and a jungle that briefly became the site of one of the deadliest tragedies in American history. It's a nation built from 6 different peoples brought together by colonization, slavery, and indenture, sitting on some of the oldest rock on Earth, 2/3 of it claimed by its own neighbor. And after centuries of being an afterthought, it just became, almost overnight, one of the fastest growing economies on the planet, with the rest of the world suddenly paying very close attention to a stretch of coastline it used to ignore entirely. Guyana was never actually empty or unimportant. It was just waiting for everyone else to notice. After these 25 facts about Guyana, which one surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you want more hidden corners of South America, let me know which country you want covered next. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next video.